This is Pramod Nair of the Department of English, the University of Hyderabad, and we have been in the last couple of sessions exploring the critical genealogies that have been instrumental in shaping post-humanist thought in specific ways. Today, we shall be exploring feminist epistemologies, ethics informed by feminism, and the links of these two, or the influence of these two upon post-humanism. Several of these we have already touched upon in passing, in some little detail, some in greater detail over the last few sessions, and you will see intersections and overlaps across, say, the critique of liberal humanism and the critical race theory approaches to traditional humanist quote-unquote values and what humanism proposes in turn. So today we, as I said, turn to feminist approaches to post-humanism, or what we can think of as the feminist post-humanities, which would be a term that people like Rosi Braidotti and others, Cecilia Asberg and others, have popularized over the last few years. Feminist approaches to post-humanism call for a re-evaluation of several different kinds of relationships. What do we mean by this? They want, as in the feminist approaches to post-humanism and feminist post-humanities in Cecilia Asberg, Rosi Braidotti and others, they ask for a rethinking of the relationship between political animals, that is the human, and the other than or more than human. The relationship between political creatures like humans and other than or more than human. What is the relationship between them? You will recall that in the previous session, we did discuss the ideological stance or prejudice, if you want to be more particular and perhaps not very polite, called speciesism, that humanity sets itself much higher than other animals. So you have a hierarchy of life forms where humanity comes at the top and all others are way lower. And speciesism is what enables the humans to say, given the fact that we are superior, given the fact that we are better, we have the right to dominate the lower level or lower forms of life. And speciesism is something that the feminist epistemologists, the feminist post-humanists are also worried about, because they note the fact that this hierarchy enables exploitation. Feminist post-humanities also calls for a rethinking of the relationship between different kinds of bodies, male versus female, human versus non-human, normal bodies versus the non-normal, subnormal or abnormal bodies, bodies with prostheses, aging bodies, bodies with various different kinds of disability, but we'll come to disability in a separate unit altogether. So what is the relationship between different kinds of bodies? Think, for example, of the prejudice in favor of fair-skinned people, of a certain kind of body mass index, slim figures in feminine bodies, female bodies, musculature of a certain kind in male bodies or sporting bodies, etc., etc. So what is the relationship between these? How have norms about these bodies emerged? And what do those norms produce as consequences for those who don't fit the norm? Okay, feminists or feminist post-humanities is also interested in the relationship between different kinds of technologies. So, for example, what kind of value do we place on intellectual activity and technologies, say coding and computer science or nuclear technology and other forms? Finally, they are also interested in the relationships between different environments. So home as an environment, as an ecosystem, versus say the office, the school, professions, which means, say, nursing as a profession, or doing science as a profession, or if you want to become a zookeeper, what does that mean? So what are the different environments? But that is one way of thinking about it. But they are also interested in different ecosystems and different environments where, for example, forms of life are, like I said several times before, and I would like to reiterate, are hierarchically placed. Who's in charge of that kind of environment? What are the systems of governance of environments like that? And of course, the problem we face now of climate crisis and climate change. What kinds of environments are left to us, are available to us? What kinds of environments are available to other forms of life? What have we done to retain, to heal, to sustain forms of environment that make it possible for different forms of life to have a fairly moderate, we cannot say equal, but acceptable levels of living. So we're interested in those kinds of environments as well. And feminist eco-criticism, as you know, is very high on the rhetoric of pollution and things like that. So feminist critiques begin by rejecting the Eurocentric and the normative humanist ideal of the man. Feminist post-humanities, feminist critiques, feminist epistemologies begin with this, that what is the notion of this thing called man, this entity called man? And just to revisit a point we have made before, who is included in the category of man and who is excluded from it? What are the normative conditions under which some people become acceptable in this category of man, and what are the conditions under which people are excluded? And we have mentioned this in passing on several occasions in the past, that, for example, in a state moving towards genocide, you begin to see signs where some forms of life are deemed to be unacceptable. The example would be the Holocaust or any genocidal state, including Sarajevo, Rwanda, and others, where people of a specific ethnic group, people of a specific community are deemed to be less than human. So for the feminists and for feminist legal scholars, feminist philosophers, the category of man was never universal. The category of man was an exclusionary mode of organizing the world. So feminist post-humanities decenter the man. The man here is written preferably with an uppercase M. So feminists argue that the idea that humans are exceptional must end, and that man, as in the male, at the center of humanity, must also cease to be at the center. What do we mean by this? Remember, we spoke about this, that speciesism is about seeing ourselves as positioned at a higher level and that we are exceptional. We are the only rational creatures. We are the only creatures who are modern, who have language, etc., etc. Human exceptionalism, as this is called, needs to end, and so does the idea that man is at the center. Therefore, you see that the feminist epistemological critics, the feminist legal scholars, the feminist philosophers, and feminist literary critics, of course, pay particular attention to domains that have emerged, say, in the last 20 years. That would be animal studies, about which we spoke about already, but also plant studies and disability studies. And they see that these as part of humanities. So humanities cannot be about human exceptionalism. They cannot be about centering just the man. Humanities needs to have a much larger mandate to look at different forms of life, to look at different configurations of life. Remember, in the previous session, we spoke about the fact that all forms of life have anima. They are animated by a vital force. So the question is, if plants and animals, if humans and lizards have the same vital force, then how come we organize them in a hierarchic system? That these as are superior, the others are inferior. Why is it that we have this hierarchy of life forms when all life forms have the same animating force? So for the feminist epistemological critics, feminist philosophers, decentering the human, rejecting human universalism and human exceptionalism, followed by decentering the man as the center, are all interrelated. You first need to make sure that the human is not exceptional. The human is not the center of the world. Man is not at the center of the world. So their insistence that we also look at, say, plant and animals, animal life forms, and disabled bodies as a part of how we come to an understanding of the form of life itself. So, feminist post-humanities and the idea of difference. Initiated first by post-structuralist thinkers adapting the work of Jacques Derrida, Helen Cizot and others, critics like Luce Irigaray, and there is a tradition from Luce Irigaray to Lucy Braidotti and others. They have all looked at each other's work. So feminist philosophies of sexual difference have critiqued dominant masculinity and have said that humanism and its so-called universalism are both built around Eurocentric ideas, that the white race and the white male are at the center. So for people working with feminist ideas of sexual difference, like Luce Irigaray and others that I mentioned, the idea of the universal human is itself a Eurocentric one. It centers the European white male as the origin of all, shall we say, social order and forms of thinking. Difference is therefore a key word in feminist epistemology because difference is about power. For example, racial difference or gender difference produces unequal wages, unequal human rights, unequal everything. So the question of difference is actually for feminist critiques a question of power. Who has power? How did they acquire power? How do they retain power? These become important precisely because difference determines life. Oh, when we say you are different, what do we mean by this? For the feminists, the very idea of difference is crucial because it is structured around binary opposites, those who have power, those who don't. So that's the first move. The second one, more relevant to post-human studies and post-humanist thought, is the feminist interest in technoscience, basically technology and science put together. Okay, so technoscience. Feminist critiques see technoscience as simply one more field, one more instrument of perpetuating gender inequality, which is to say that feminist critiques of technology and critics of technology and technoscience note that gender inequalities are exacerbated and amplified via technology and science. They further see this as technoscience as possessing and determined by an instrumental view of women. And if you recall what we said about speciesism, for feminists, the instrumental view of women is extended to plants, animals, and the earth too. So there's a continuum of oppression, according to feminist critiques of technoscience, that technoscience, by instrumentalizing women, also instrumentalizes plants, animals, the earth itself. Women, plants, animals, the earth are all subordinated to the man. Essentially, feminist critiques of technoscience are speaking about power and how science or technoscience, to be more accurate, encodes and reinforces, amplifies, in some cases even magnifies power relations across genders, but also across species. So for feminist critiques, especially writing after Rosie Braidotti, Kathleen Hales and others, and the names I mentioned before, Cecilia Esberg and others, they argue that we need to think of relationality and sharing, mutuality and co-becoming, the phrase that becomes very popular with Donna Haraway and others about how we become with, or as Haraway puts it, becoming with. We become with other creatures. We don't become on our own, we become with other creatures. So feminists argue in favor of relationality and sharing, mutuality and co-becoming rather than hierarchies. So they are opting for a horizontal set of connections, the network. When we spoke about cybernetics, we mentioned the fact that consciousness is also now because we are embodied and embedded. The point I'm trying to emphasize is, for feminist critics of technoscience, relationality and network and horizontal connections are a response to and a overturning of power relations which are top-down, which are hierarchic and vertical. So they are suggesting that perhaps it's time to think in terms of relationalities, not in terms of verticals of unequal and unfair power structures. Feminist philosophers also note the fact that technologies are not neutral. Technologies are created out of a particular worldview, out of a sense that this is what we want to do. And the technology is invented so that it enables you to do what you want to do. In other words, what we are looking at here is the fact that technoscience serves a specific instrumental purpose for humans. And this purpose is about dealing with or governing other creatures. So technology has its influence, has its role to play in human behavior, how human behavior works. Next is feminist post-humanities and situated knowledges, a term which became very popular again after the writings of Donna Haraway, arguably one of the most significant influences on post-humanist thought in the last decade and a half or so. Haraway makes the point that instead of a universalizing idea of knowledge, we need to think in terms of situated knowledges. What do we mean by this? Haraway and the later critics noted that knowledge is not a bird's eye or a God trick. The God trick term comes from Haraway, where we look down and you see everything. Knowledge is localized. It's embedded in specific contexts. All claims to neutrality, objectivity, universalism actually erases the fact that science has been governed by policies, devices, funding that are determinedly male, heterosexual, and whites. So we don't see science as determined by power or power relations, to be more accurate, power relations. Haraway says knowledge is produced out of this structure, but actually knowledge has to be focused on in terms of their local origins, what now has come to be called situated knowledges. So instead of knowledge coming from the top, there has to be knowledge that comes from local places, from small pockets, and an awareness that this knowledge comes out of a system of power relations. It's not random and generated and universal. Next, feminist post-humanities and transhumanism. Transhumanism, as you know, is the belief that we can overcome the limitations of the human form by making use of technology. But feminist post-humanities opposes transhumanism because it simply says we can transcend the body through science, but it retains the mind-body binary. The body has to be reinvented, reinvigorated, and improved, but it retains the mind-body binary. But the mind, as you know from the lesson on cognition and consciousness studies and the influence of this on posthumanism, is that cognition and consciousness are an emergent condition that come from our being embedded, from being part of a network, from being linked to others. So feminist posthumanities notes the fact that the transcendence of the body means that you are simply again valorizing a certain kind of body, a certain attitude towards the body. By rejecting the masculine Eurocentric idea that the mind is the most superior, and we spoke about this at some length when we were discussing cognition and consciousness studies, that by rejecting the romantic idea that the mind is supreme, feminist posthumanities highlights matter and materialism, that bodily matter, embodiment, our connections with other bodies are central. You can't wish it away. It does not approve of the idea of perfectibility, that the human body can go on being improved and perfected. Finally, we will look at feminist posthumanities and environmental thought. Ecofeminism is something all of you are perhaps familiar with in some way or the other. But the feminist posthumanities focuses on, as we have already seen, an ethical approach to difference. And here, for them, ecological thought is central. We need both anthropo and biodiversity. Species, gender, and racial differences have to be accounted for. There is no question of universalizing these. Man as a universal category cannot be any longer placed at the center of things. And they argue that it is because of man, and please note man with an uppercase M, man's focus on looking for more resources, utilization of resources, utilization of other species and other races has resulted in the overuse and abuse of the planet. So for feminists within the posthumanities, part of the reason, part of the cause for what the state of the earth is now is because man has been in charge, man has had power. So man has gone after the overutilization of natural resources like oil, but it has also meant that man has had control over and exploited other forms of life, including women, including other ethnic races. And please recall, we spoke in our contextualizing of this in terms of plantations and slavery as well. So for the feminists, it's important to recognize that man being in charge has resulted in a certain degradation of the earth. Man being in charge has also resulted in a degradation and control and oppression of and over other ethnic groups, women, plants, and animals. So, if you take just one example, Astrid Lindgren's famous feminist posthumanist argument notes the fact that human bodies are 70% of water. So is the planet. And therefore, Neymanis proposes what she calls a hydrocommons, which links all forms of life. And she says, let's think in terms of the relationality defined via liquids. We link corporeal materiality, which is our body, to the environment. And she says, the neglect of this relationality, the neglect of this embedding is the reason for our planetary crisis. What does she mean by this? What she's saying is, we don't recognize the material nature of our bodies because we have always, following the European Enlightenment, focused on the mind, that the mind is superior, the mind is the governing principle, the mind has power, the mind should be in control. That we are who we are because of our bodies, and even our consciousness, even our mind emerges from being embedded and embodied in bodies. And if our bodies are 70% water like the planets, then there is a relationality of materials. So this is just one example of the film, and this is Astrid Lehmann-Hess's brilliant work on the hydrocarbons. What the feminist environmentalists are speaking within the school of posthumanism is that we have neglected the material in favor of something else. And we have given the charge of this material to man. And the result is this. So, as you can see, feminist epistemology, feminist philosophy, and feminist eco-criticism are central to rethinking the relationship of humans with the world. Thank you.